Weapons are the most dangerous thing in our society. They kill, they maim, they increase the degree of violence between citizens, and they increase the degree of violence between police and citizens. And we say that anything which we can do to release the extent to which individuals are able to hold arms is going to be beneficial. So what are we going to do for you today? It's pretty simple. We're going to abolish the ownership of guns by private individuals, and we're going to only allow them to be owned by law enforcement agencies, which basically means the police or similar law enforcement agencies. Where are we setting this? We're setting this in stable governments the world over. We don't think that the principle is at any means limited to Western liberal democracies. We think that it holds as much for other stable governments. We're obviously not talking about Somalia though. So, what are we going to do for you today? Firstly, I'm going to look at the rights argument and why that's absolutely ludicrous, but move on to the crucial point, which is how gun ownership and a reduction in gun ownership brings two core benefits. The first of those is in citizen-to-citizen interactions. The second of those is in interactions between the police and citizens, or police and criminals. What Cheyne's going to do for you today is broaden this to your sort of non-criminal individuals. He's going to look at why this changes the culture of violence in society. He's also going to look at why this reduces citizen-to-citizen deaths, the sort of accidental deaths which are rife in the United States at the moment. He's going to address any black market claims which the negative team try to make. So let's look at rights, because surely the one ground which you could try to stake ownership of rights on is that individuals have a right to own things, and that the having of a gun somehow brings with it an autonomous right in and of itself. We think that's ludicrous for three reasons. The first is that the claim that there's an inherent right to guns doesn't exist anywhere really outside of the United States. So we say that the argument that individuals should have an absolute right, at the exception of an absurd bit of the US Constitution, just doesn't stack up the world over. But even if that does hold, and you run down this little line, we say that you don't have an absolute right to things, and you don't have an absolute right to control coercive force. What do we mean by this? We say that all the time we limit the rights of individuals to exercise coercive force. For example, if somebody's behaving badly or you think they're breaking the law, that doesn't give you the power to exert a citizen's arrest on them, even though we might give that power to the state. We see guns as analogous to this. Even when you're using guns in self-defense, you're using guns for beneficial purposes, you don't gain a right to use that gun to advance that purpose, because the state has a monopoly on the exercise of power. And then in similar situations, such as where a person might want to arrest somebody else, that we don't give that right. So we say there's no principle for giving individuals this limited coercive right. But further to that, that's purely situations where individuals are exercising this right in a positive way. We say, and this is our third point, that there are plenty of times where individuals exercise that right in a negative way. And we say that here, rights in general only exist to the extent they hold up good societal outcomes. So what we say is that any argument the NED can make about the strength of rights and the autonomous right to guns rests on them showing that something is a good thing. They might say, for example, we think bodily autonomy is a good thing, therefore guns are an exercise of your bodily autonomy, therefore you should be able to have guns. We say it doesn't stack up, because that rests on saying bodily autonomy is a good thing. So in circumstances where guns no longer advance a good conception in life, for example, where they harm other people's bodily autonomy, we're happy transgressing that. So for those three reasons, we think there's no right to guns. We're happy to move on to the crux of this debate, which is why we'll eliminate gun holding. We'll eliminate gun holding for four reasons. The first is that gun holding production is incredibly large and hard to manage. What this means is that you're not going to have individual gangs sort of building up arms warfare in their backyard, sort of make your own gun kits like you might have with a P-Lab or an ecstasy operation. What that means is the second point. The only way people can get operations into the country will be through importing guns or through buying them from a sort of recognised retailer. We're outlawing the purchase of them from a recognised retailer unless you're a law enforcement agency. We don't think that you're capable of sort of pretending to be a cop and walking in and buying a gun if you're a sort of dodgy criminal, because we think there's plenty of certification procedures there. So the only option, therefore, is that they sort of ship it in from overseas or ship it in subterfuge. We say again that guns are very large things, that they're difficult, particularly to bring in big shipments. In contrast to something like coke, which you can store inside a surfboard, it's far more easy to seize on guns because of their large nature and the fact that they come in large shipments. The third reason we say is that the very purpose of guns is to use them. When you use a gun, you need to use it against somebody. This is in stark contrast to, say, contraband DVDs, which you might want to watch like a dodgy porno in your backyard. That's a purely selfish interaction, so there's no need for the police to find out about that. The difference with guns is the essence of using a gun is using that gun against somebody else. So it has to bring it into the public sphere, into a sphere where the police are able to see it, and into a sphere where the police are able to confiscate it. What that means is that the police can take those guns, put them away, lock them up, destroy them, whatever they want to do, and take those guns out of circulation. And this brings me to sort of final encapsulating point, which is because of all these reasons, you're going to get less guns in circulation. We think that less guns in circulation is critical. If we take the example of Britain, which has very tight gun laws, the Operation Strict Gun Laws has limited the ability of guns to get into Britain, in contrast to the United States, where there's massive amounts of guns floating around because of the legal supply of guns. So what we say is that when you stop guns being supplied legally, and when you have an effective system to reduce the production of guns, then those guns aren't able to come into the country. So, why is this all really critical? And it's critical for two reasons. Firstly, for citizens. We say that citizen-to-citizen interactions often involve the use of guns. The first main scenario for this is gang warfare. So gangs often use guns to fight against each other. Gangs are operating in a sphere where they're trying to take out a sort of power balance to achieve supremacy in their area. We say that that's always going to happen. What we don't want to do is give those gangs an increased ability to produce collateral damage. The difference between those gangs carrying out their battle with guns and samurai swords is that with guns it's far easier to kill another person, and that the sort of ease of pulling a trigger and the consequences of that magnify far more quickly. So not only is there more immediate damage, but there's also more chance of death, which is more likely to produce response and retaliation from neighbouring gangs. What that leads is it drives gangs into a cycle of violence which they can't get out of. The difference with using something which is a more physical weapon is it's a lot easier to pull back because there's not one pull of the trigger which automatically causes the death of people. Instead, there's a multitude of actions which can build up sort of 10 or 15 beats of the baseball bat before the person dies. We say that you can exercise one beat of the baseball bat, and that's a far better way for gangs to conduct warfare given that it's going to happen. The second scenario for citizens versus citizens, though, is where a citizen comes up against a powerful individual, say a rampaging serial killer. When that serial killer tries to punish an individual, we say that if that individual has a gun, they don't stand a chance. When you're coming up against somebody who has extensive gun experience, the idea that a gun might be used in self-defense is ludicrous because that person has a far greater skill with that weapon and is going to damage you far more. We say that that still applies if somebody comes to beat you up with a baseball bat, but that if somebody is attacking you as an individual with a baseball bat, they're less likely to be able to commit that harm. That power imbalance is far less significant when somebody attacks you with a baseball bat than when they do with the gun. Finally, we say that in the interaction of police and citizens, this helps. We say at the moment the police are in grave danger, and that when they try to interact with a person, they get shut down. Often people get holed up in their homes with extensive arsenals of weapons, cases of rocket launchers being found on gang premises, and we say that that puts police in imminent danger and leaves police unable to respond to crime. Ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to say that there's no absolute right to guns, and any attempt to claim an absolute right to anything is ludicrous. But more than that, we're proud to say that these will decrease, and when they decrease, you prevent the collateral damage from gang warfare, you allow private citizens to live safer lives, and you allow the police not to be taken on with bazookas. We're proud to support.
Right, well, I welcome now the first negative to open their case. That's a video.
Still recording, sorry, I'm going back to big things.
I'm not in the screen.
No.
Sorry.
So 1 code 6, 2 and 8, is that right? Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Great.
Why are you so tall?
Sorry. To me, my life is the most important thing I possess. From my life come all my rights and all my roles within that society. To restrict my ability to protect my life against those who would want to take it away from me for their own nefarious purposes is unacceptable within today's debate. So what we propose to do is, we would obviously have a slight degree of regulation on guns. I restrict people over 18, who are mentally stable, and who lack a criminal record. We have four major arguments to bring to you today. I'll be introducing the first three, and my second speaker, Paul, will be talking about the effect on those with the disadvantage the affirmative team's model will have. But before I get into the main arguments, I'd just like to do a few points for rebuttal. So, firstly, onto the effectiveness. Firstly, with the rights point, I will clash with this later in my substantive. But on the second point with the affirmative, about the effectiveness of a gun ban, firstly, what we say is that guns are everywhere, right? We see guns throughout the world. They're not actually that difficult to manufacture. And that's clearly shown by the sheer number of guns that are in circulation around the world. Furthermore than that, nor is it really like a complete and total mischaracterization that these guns are like huge, right? You could never sneak these guns across a border because people are carrying these massive guns around. Guns are actually very small in some situations and can be easily smuggled across borders and over gaps. So guns will still get into the country. We're not saying circulation will be like as much as it is without a ban on guns. However, the important point is the people who really want guns, the criminals within our society, will still get these guns. On the citizens, we don't largely care about gang warfares and gangs fighting each other. That's fine. Gangs can fight each other with whatever they want, people who break the law. But on the individual's ability to defend themselves from those others, the analysis that, if you're being attacked by someone with a gun and they're far more skilled from you, you're still stuck, is completely false, right? Look at the different skill level between using a gun where you point, pull the trigger, and shoot it, opposed to using a baseball bat or something else you're going to be attacked with. In a situation where you're fighting someone in hand-to-hand combat, their skill is going to be far more important than a situation where you're fighting someone with a gun. So the gun actually gives those who are less skilled an ability to defend themselves. Finally, on to the police. As we said, criminals are still going to get these guns, so the people the police are after, the criminals, will still actually have these guns. So we don't see that's particularly important in this debate. So let's now turn to the principle of self-defense, right? It's not the right to have a thing. We're not talking about the right people have to own a gun. It's the right that I have to protect my life from others who would do me harm, right? Within our society, all our rights are centered around the most important right, which is the right people have to life, the right people have to survive, and the right people have to protect that life against other people taking away from that. That's the basis of all our rights in our society. The basis of protecting other people's lives is so they can continue to live happily. Therefore, an individual has a right to defend themselves and defend those lives from those people who want to hurt them. Now, it's very clear that guns give individuals an ability to defend their lives from those who would do them harm. And guns give individuals in our society a very effective way of defending their lives from those who do them harm, even when they're relatively unskilled with them. So guns don't require much skill to use, and guns are a very, very effective way of defending my life. So quite apart from any harms to society, as an individual, I have a right to defend my life from those who do me harm. And the only real option for me to do this is to have a right to own a gun. So let's now turn to the second point of this debate, which is the idea of putting up what's going to happen to the good citizens under their model, opposed to what's happening under the criminals under their model. Right. So criminals are still obviously going to get these guns even with a ban. In the same way that criminals manage to get things like drugs and things and other illegal items, things like drugs and other illegal items. And as I've already shown you from the affirmative point, guns are not that hard to smuggle over borders. They can be more difficult to produce in your backyard, perhaps, than it would be to make up some drugs. But the vast majority of drugs are actually imported across borders between countries, and they're from countries which have much lower regulation. So we see these factories that are making the guns are not going to be in your basement. They're going to be in somewhere which has limited police force, limited ability to regulate. And these small guns can then be imported within the country. So what's this going to mean? Well, that tips a balance between the law-abiding citizens who don't have the guns on the status quo, right? Under their model. The law-abiding citizens who can no longer get the guns, and the criminals who have the guns, right? And that puts the people who are abiding the law at an immediate disadvantage in any exchange that they might be having with these criminals, right? So it puts me, as a person, at an immediate disadvantage from someone who wants to mug me because they will have a gun and I will not, right? So it's like reducing my ability to defend myself from people who are committing crimes against me. And just while on this point, it's worth noting that the ability of the state to protect people is obviously present, but it's not omnipresent, right? The state is not there in all situations to protect me, and nor is it there in all countries, which I'll get to later, to protect me. So if I'm a dairy owner in a rural township, the ability of the state to protect me with the police force is fairly limited, whereas my ability to protect myself with a gun is obviously far more effective. But finally, there's also, under this point, a point about disincentives, right? And this is when the founders stand up and said, well, you know, in order to have a gun, you have to use it. We actually dispute this. In fact, the knowledge that people have guns actually discourages people from committing crimes against them, right? Because if you're like a burglar, right, who's going to rob a house, are you more or less likely to rob a house when you know that the person you're robbing will not have a gun and you will? They have no ability to defend themselves. Or when you know that they might have a gun and might have ability to defend themselves. It's actually going to disincentivize these people from breaking it. Finally, let's have a look at this third and final point, which is like the lack of state protection, the lack of ability of the state to protect people within their society. So as I said, this debate doesn't have to be pitched in somewhere as extreme as Somalia. It can be pitched in lots of like borderline cases around the world, in countries which have like stable governments but still a relatively ineffective police force, or countries which have problems with corruption within their police force, despite the fact they have a stable government, right? So this is on two levels. So firstly, on the question of corrupt police, when we look at places like Kyrgyzstan and Kenya, where we see corruption within that police force, we see that minorities and individuals are often abused by that police force, right? So people who are obeying the law and living within the bounds of the state are abused by those who have power over them, the police, and they target those certain minority groups within those countries. What guns do is guns discourage policemen from picking on individuals in individual situations, right? And not necessarily because the law is biased against these people. When policemen are biased against this person, the knowledge that they have a gun and the ability to defend themselves works against the police when they want to pick on them outside the law, when the police are themselves corrupt or the state is itself corrupt. But on the second level, when the police force is ineffective, right? Because it's got a lack of funding. Citizens are not going to be adequately defended by the instruments of the state within their country in order to look after themselves, right? So when we see that the police force, and even in places which have a police force which is successfully funded, the police force isn't in all places at all times, right? So the police force is not going to protect people from these criminals in all cases at all times. So that means that citizens have to have some way of defending themselves. And because guns don't require a great deal of skill, guns are a perfect opportunity for citizens to defend themselves from those who would do them harm, either when the state or when the police force is self-corrupt or the police force is simply ineffective. So, because we see that while you may not be able to build a gun out of your Meccano kit in your back basement, there are lots of guns out there in circulation, and guns will still be getting into the country if you ban guns, because they're not that difficult to import. And because we see that my right to defend my life from others is fundamental to my ability to function within the society, we are very, very happy to negate banning gun ownership.
Right, thank you very much. But now I'd like to invite the second speech from the Affirmative team to continue the discussion. Mr. William Cheyne, QC.
Thank you. Eight minutes, eh?
Yep, there's one clip at 6 and 2 at 8. Sufficient?
Yep, that's good. Am I in shot?
You are in shot.
Just give me a second to get my solid watch up. Yeah. The entire negative team's case is premised on the idea that if we allow basically free ownership of guns within society, except for the few sort of stupid exceptions that they put out there, that somehow people will be safer. That's what their entire case is built upon. They said they had 4 points for you, like the right to self-defense, that built down to people have a right to protect themselves because people need to be safe. They said the state can't do a good job, so the people need to be safe. They said that knowing that people have guns provides a disincentive, so people need to be safe.
and then they bought some, and then the only sort of tangential point was the point about smuggling and how like that limits the practicality of our model. So all we need to do on side affirmative is prove that people will be safer under our model, that less people will get shot and killed under our model, and I think Louis has already done that perfectly well, but I'm going to do it a little bit more for you. So what I'm going to deal with is firstly this idea of like, will people be safer? Then I want to deal with issues surrounding the black market and all of those types of things. And then I'm going to bring you my sort of substantive points, which are about accidents within the home and how these are actually like a really big concern and a really good reason to ban guns. And Paul can scoff all he wants, but like you're far more likely to die like of an accident in your home with a gun than you are to use it in self-defense, right? So like there's like a greater harm there than any benefit that it's providing. And then finally I want to look at the idea of like, you know, the role of guns in society, and particularly hunting and the violent kind of culture that it creates. Okay, so firstly looking at this idea of will people be safer. The first point I want to look at is incentives, because this was something Kieran said that I found absolutely hilarious. He said that if a burglar knows you have a gun, he's not going to break into your house. False. If a burglar knows you have a gun and he really, really wants your stuff, then he's going to also take a gun and he's going to use it against you, right? Like, that's why the US has such a big crime problem, right? And so, like, the argument that there's a disincentive there simply doesn't work. That's why they call it an arms race, right? It's because people know that other people have guns, so they get guns themselves and they use them against each other. Like, it's not like nuclear weapons. We don't have mutually assured destruction. We have, like, people having guns and, like, using them against each other. So we say that that's why their incentive point falls down, right? He also said that guns are a really good leveler because they don't require a great degree of skill. So when the big bad gang member comes and attacks me, I can shoot him with my handgun. Ladies and gentlemen, handguns are incredibly difficult to use, right? Like this amount of wavering in your hand, which there will probably be when you're quite scared being attacked by someone twice your size, can lead to like a divergence of 5 meters over like the length of this room. So there's a really, really difficult issue in using guns. And like, there's pointed to examples in the US, or even that hilarious YouTube video of New Zealand police officers trying to shoot the rabid dog and like firing 30 shots before they actually manage to hit the thing, right? Like people, even police officers struggle to use guns. So, like, and those are proper guns, not just little handguns that have a greater degree of uncertainty in the variation and movement in your hand. So we say that, like, guns are very hard to use, so the argument that they're a leveler doesn't work. Like, secondly, gang members are going to be more useful at using guns. So, like, it just doesn't work that they don't require a lot of skill. Secondly, like, the third point that they made was that there's a lack of state protection, right? And they said that this was kind of like, people have this right to self-defense because it's important that people can protect themselves. What we are doing under our model is providing greater state protection, right? That's the whole premise of our model, is creating a society where people are safer. That's what our model is premised upon. If less people have guns, then people will be safer. If the police have more guns than the bad guys in society, then people will be safer. The state is doing its job and removes the sort of necessity that they brought there. And then finally, they had this idea of the right to self-defense, which just completely fell down, right? It was based on practicalities and all those things that I've already dealt with, so I'm not going to talk about it again. Right, black market. Okay, in terms of the black market, what we say in response to this is they had 2 points. They said, firstly, that there's lots of guns in circulation. There's lots of guns in circulation because it's currently legal to buy guns, right? So there are lots of factories producing guns. That's why there are lots of guns in society. The fact of the matter is that the US, which has the laxest gun laws in the world, has a much bigger black market for guns than countries like the UK, who also have a gun problem, but it's much harder to get guns, right? The reason for that is when you have a legitimate market for guns, right, it's easier for someone to go out there who's 18, who doesn't have a criminal conviction, to buy a gun and then supply it to gangs, right? It's much easier for that to happen when you have a free market for guns, if you will, to supply into that black market to then provide everyone else. What we say is if you if you prevent retail sale of guns, then people have to bring their own guns into the country, right? Take a country like New Zealand. It would be relatively easy to eradicate like most guns within society because we have a closed sea border, right? We can just get rid of the ones that are already here and then prevent them. This comes into the second point they made about easy to smuggle. They said, oh, they're easy to smuggle because they're small. They're also metal, right? Like, customs has metal detectors. Anyone ever been on a plane? Like, they have X-ray machines. There's quite a distinct shape to a gun. Like, all these are relatively easy things to pick up in terms of smuggling, right? So we say that like that's the answer to that problem about the black market. Firstly, that they're easy to identify in terms of smuggling. Secondly, there's lots of guns because it's legal to sell them at the moment. And thirdly, the black market under their model will necessarily be bigger and lead to more gangs having guns than under our model. So that doesn't hold. Right, coming on to my points about accidents. And like this is just a further reason why we shouldn't have guns in society. Because we say, firstly, that like there's a much greater chance of you being injured in an accident in your home, like by someone you know, so like your child getting hold of your gun, or your fiance or partner going crazy and shooting you with it, than using it in self-defense against a home invader, right? So in the US, you have a 1 in a million chance of using a gun for self-defense in your home, and a 20 in a million chance of having that gun used against you in an unexpected or accidental way. So there's a much higher chance of you being damaged by that gun. What we also say is, like, even if they want to talk about regulation and safety and all those types of things, it's impossible to be in everyone's home and to regulate that type of thing, right? So it just can't be done. And thirdly, we say that, like, there are often mistakes with self-defense. And so, like, there are a lot of deaths in the US and in other places where people have this kind of, like, right to self-defense, where, you know, the father will shoot the supposed intruder who's coming into his house at 12:30 at night, when in fact it's his daughter's boyfriend sneaking in for a bit of sex, right? Like, we say that that's the sort of thing that you really want to prevent, and that kind of stuff happens all the time, right? So we say that that's really bad. This final point I want to bring about like the role of violence in society, just at the end here, is basically saying that the idea is, like, if you have a culture that accepts the use of guns as like a valid part of society, you say you promote violence, right? You promote this idea that it's an acceptable way to defend yourself is using violence rather than like relying on state organs. So we say that, like, in a society that says to individuals, right, you have a right to have guns because the state can't do enough to protect you, so you go out there and protect yourself. We say that's actually really bad because that incentivizes people into like gang-like behaviour. If they think, oh, the state doesn't care about me, it isn't going to do anything to protect me, it wants me to protect myself, which is like the rhetoric of their case, then you're more likely to be sort of anti-establishment, you're more likely to get hold of guns, you're more likely to create yourself a violent culture. So we say that's a really, really bad thing and something that we don't want. And so we're very, very proud to say that only law enforcement officers should have guns.
All right, well now I'd like to welcome Mr. Paul Hunt to tell us what he thinks.
Oh, you're going to stand there, are you?
Oh, sorry. I should
No, it's okay. It's all right. I'll move things.
Follow.
It could be that Cheyne's just not a succinct person at all, but when he stood here and told us we had such a simple case, it actually took him quite a while to explain it all. But the thing he missed is that we had a point right out at first about the right to self-defense, and that was never responded to, and it wasn't responded to by Louis because he was talking about property ownership. That's different. So what I'm going to do in the first part of my speech is go over this right to self-defense and why it hasn't been addressed at all. The second thing I'm going to do is take a look at the role of guns in terms of protecting good citizens versus criminals. The third thing I'm going to do is look at the point, which again they didn't respond to, in terms about like imperfect police forces and like corrupt police forces. Again, material not touched by Cheyne. And then fourthly, I'm going to move on to the substantive points, my substantive point, and dealing with their substantive point. So starting on this idea of self-defense.
So what we told you very clearly was that the individual life is the basis for all rights, right? It's the thing that not only the individual obviously values the most themselves, because they can only be themselves with the right to be alive, but also the fact that humanity values the most itself. And we say, given that life is the absolute, prime thing we value in society, we say that everyone should have the absolute right to have the capacity to defend themselves in the case of that. So we say they should be able to take on, maximal capacity to be able to protect themselves against being killed, because the individual is important. Like, the only analysis we got was like, oh, this is only advocated in the US. Like, people outside the US are also people too. So we don't see how that's an argument. So now that they need to respond to that rights analysis, because we say that puts the presumption in our favour, and we say that given life is so important, we say they need to address that. So looking at the analysis of criminals versus good citizens, what we told you on side negative is that it's morally wrong to disadvantage those who obey the law versus those criminals who do not obey the law. And we gave you two specific reasons as to why we think gun ownership is a really good protection against those who do obey the law. The first reason is that there's a time lag, and the fact that the police can never be everywhere at once. And we think that that dairy owners who get shot and attacked should have the capacity to be able to do themselves. Their response is it's really hard to use a gun, it's really hard to shoot people. Okay, one, we think they should have the opportunity to at least try and get rid of the thing. I don't know why that's funny. So what they're saying is that really you should just have nothing at all. We think that they should at least be able to attempt in the case when they're being attacked to be able to defend themselves. They think that a dairy owner would be able to physically stop a criminal who comes in with a gun. That's absurd, right? We think in some cases where it's physically impossible, we think that of course you're going to have to rely on a gun. The second thing we told you is that it disincentivizes criminals from going into places in the first place when they know they have a gun. Their response was oh, no, it's not true. They'll just carry a gun. Look, the point is that it acts as a disincentive, right? Why? Because you increase the cost of the criminal going in, right? Criminals still make some kind of calculation, right? And so if they know that they're going to go into a place where the person has absolutely no protection and there's going to be no physical cost imposed of them, of course they're going to be less likely to go in the first place. The other point which is important here is their point which essentially says is that what they're trying to say, in our model, there will be no criminals carrying guns. And so, there'll be no need for these people to hold guns. Okay, we've got a few responses to this. The first piece of analysis was you have to import guns. You can only import guns. Okay. Wake up, somewhere there are places where gun production goes on in the first place, right? So in those areas, right, there's obviously still going to be guns floating around, and the fact that there's guns floating around, you can't just make invisible Harry Potter all guns which exist at the moment, right? There are guns which are in existence in the moment. And so we say that those are going to be able to get through criminal networks the same way that drugs do. And why is that? Because these criminal networks aren't stupid, right? They're relatively sophisticated in how they get. They're guns are metal. They're not going to walk through the metal detector with a gun, right? They're going to have ways which they, package it like they package drugs, in parcels, pretending not to be a gun and stuff.
Drugs aren't metal. Guns are.
But the thing is, right, if your detectors are so good at picking up metal, why can't they pick up drugs, by chemical reactions or whatever? Well, the fact is that they don't pick up drugs. And you conceded that that there was regulatory imperfections when Cheyne said, oh, but you can't always regulate guns in the home run. That's right, regulatory methods are always imperfect, and we think there will always be a degree of smuggling into the things. Now moving on to the third point about corrupt and imperfect police forces. So we say there are states which simply do not have the funding to get enough police out in situations or states where the police force have particular like bias to them, or regionals where it's just very hard to staff. And we say in those areas that it's really important that people have guns to act as a check on the bias force and to be able to protect themselves when the state doesn't have that capacity. If you accept that at least the police force has to carry guns, there's obviously a reason for that, because it recognises you need to keep your civilians safe. And so what we say in these situations where like there is inadequate means to get a gun, or like the police force actually bias, that this again acts as a deterrent, and they can't just like model out of this by setting this in the Western world. So let's have a look at the splits. So the material we're going to bring you is the fact that this policy is like really equitable and fair, because it helps those who are like sort of most disadvantaged. And just one example of this is that there's a high incidence of women who, when they like walk back from town in certain countries, or women who, when they're out of the streets, are often mugged and attacked and raped. And we say that the ability to like carry a concealed handgun, as is like the case in most places which happens, like obviously provides those people who are physically disadvantaged and those people who are most at risk with an extra means of protection that they would not otherwise have, right? And it's no good then like saying, as they have been all the way down the line, that they won't be able to use the gun, because again we think like the ability, at least having the chance to use the gun, and sometimes it probably will work, is a really good point. Now let's respond to Cheyne's standard. So the thing was like, he was like, oh, like you guns are violent, and that's like culture is violence. Like that's what he said, right? Like you're still going to get violence, right? It's just going to be other forms. In fact, it'll be worse, because instead of like the opposite of like gang shooting, you're going to get constant like knife fightings and stuff. So we think that violence will still exist, and it will exist on a more like human to human like contact sort of form, because that's the kind of like things you're going to incentivize if you get rid of guns and people know they're not going to shot. And his point about like accidents is really absurd. We think there are things in society you do where the individual bears a risk. So like going in a car where you can crash, you could also potentially die. We don't ban going in a car. Lighting a fire at home is also really dangerous. There are lots of drunken accidents. Again, we say that's up to the individual to make up their own mind, and the risk is minimal. So we say on the side of the house, because people have the right to protect their very own like body and what they like, we say and have the right to protect themselves against crime and against people who disobey the law, we're proud to oppose.
Well, now I'd like to invite Monsieur Gavey to the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it's empirically true that countries with more guns and looser gun laws have more crime. And we say that if the case from the Affirmative team was correct, we should see exactly the opposite, where countries that have more guns have less crime. We say we don't live in Paul's libertarian paradise, we live in the real world, and in the real world, guns are used to shoot people. When you have more guns, more people get shot, and that's something we're proud to oppose on side negative. So I'm going to do 4 things we do. First, I'm going to look really, really quickly at the rights-based analysis. Secondly, I'm going to look very quickly at the practicalities, and then I'm going to move on to the meat of this debate, and I'm going to look at the effects on increased or decreased gun ownership in society on 2 levels. Firstly, in terms of people that have guns legally under the Affirmative team model, and then secondly, people that gain guns illegally under the Affirmative team model, and see what the effects are going to be on those 2 groups if we follow, rather as a counterfactual, the negative team's model. So firstly, in terms of rights, and what we had from the Affirmative side of the House is they asserted that this right existed and then described the right.
And we say, that's not enough, okay? If you want that point to stand on its own as a right, you have to explain why that right exists in society. What we say is that in every civilized society, actually, the right to self-defense doesn't exist. What defines a civilized society is that you secede that right to the state, and the state exercises it on your behalf, which is why we have police and jails and the whole criminal justice system. And Louis described that in his case when he said, we limit people's ability to commit, civilians arrests and all those kind of things, right? And we say, that's why that right doesn't exist. But we say that even if you do want that right to exist, the right to self-defense, we say it still falls back on practicalities, because that right isn't going to be unlimited. Presumably they're not going to allow people to have tanks in their driveways, or Bill Gates to have his own little private nuclear facility, right? You're still going to place limits on the right to self-defense. What determines those limits? Whether it actually makes people safer, and whether it makes for a safer society. So obviously you can use your fist to fend someone off. Should you have guns or not? Well, that depends on whether it makes society safer. We say that point still falls back on practicality. So on to the case of whether you can successfully reduce the amount of guns in society. And they've practically conceded this point, right? Obviously you can't have gun factories in countries where guns are illegal, right? They're very easy to spot. So basically this point's fallen back to how good is border control. And Polo was like, well, people get drugs in, why can't they get guns in? It's really easy to spot guns because they're made of metal. Chemical composition analysis in the air is very difficult. Metal detectors are very easy, and so we say that if countries are having gun problems, it's very easy to put everything that comes into the country through a metal detector. We say that isn't a problem, and that's why we have countries like New Zealand who have strong borders and very few guns smuggled in. And so that's the practicality. That falls outside of the house as well. So firstly, on to guys. Calm down, please. Onto the meeting today. And I first want to deal with the illegal point, because Louis spent a lot of time on this, and it was basically ignored by the affirmative side of the house. And the point is that firstly, under their model, it's very easy for people who aren't allowed guns, like people with a criminal record, to get hold of guns. Because, as Louis said, if there's a free market in guns in that country, it's easier for those guns to slip onto the black market than it is to have to smuggle them in. And so we say that under their model, gangs and other nefarious groups are going to be much more likely to be armed. And what the result of that is there's going to be much more violence. They're going to solve conflicts by shooting each other. Now, why is this bad? Now, Kieran basically said, we don't care about gangs, right? But what we say is that gang members who are often in gangs as a result of societal factors or poverty or the fact they grew up in a gang-related environment, we say those are people too, right? So if we can reduce deaths among those people, that's still good. Just because you're in a gang doesn't mean you lose all right not to have your brains shot out. But what we also say is, more importantly, is that gang violence spills over into society. That's why Mexico is such a horrendously dangerous place to go right now, is because you've got open gang conflict. Gangs are busy shooting each other on the streets, and sometimes gangs make mistakes. Like last week, 18 students were murdered because their university soccer club had the same initials, AA, as a gang, right? And so we say that if you accept gang violence, which they basically did, we don't care about gangs, we say that order spills over into society, and also ties up police resources when police could be protecting civilians. Instead, they're trying to mediate violent gang disputes. So gang violence is bad. Very bad. We've shown you we're going to reduce it on this side of the house, and they haven't even addressed that point. So that's a concrete benefit that falls to side affirmative. So on to legal people. Now, what we say is that, or people that are legally able to use guns, right? The simple fact is that we only want guns in our society if it's going to make people safer. And the facts are, Polo can use all his amazing libertarian analysis, but the empirical facts are that guns are dangerous, right? And that you're much more likely to accidentally be harmed by a gun than you are to use a gun in self-defense. Having a gun in your home is dangerous. It doesn't make you any safer. And Polo's people should have the opportunity to try and use self-defense. Well, his whole analysis about rights fell down on protecting life and people in society having the right to life. And we say that when you, that contradicts the idea that you have this absolute right to guns when it actually harms your life and makes you more likely to be shot. So we say we agree that life is very important in our society. We say guns pose a risk to that. So what about this point about self-defense, whether it's practically beneficial? Well, what this really falls down to is the incentives that operate on people. And what Polly wanted to say is that if every individual has guns, basically people will be too scared to attack them. What we've counted with on our side of the house is that if individuals have guns, then criminals are also going to have guns. Not just because they're incentivized to, but because in a society where guns are legal, it's much easier for those criminals to get guns. So instead of criminal-civilian interaction being without guns, the interaction is going to be with guns, and you're much more likely to get shot. That's clearly much more dangerous. And so what we say is that because of the fact that accidents are more likely to happen than opportunities for self-defense, and because the whole interaction is more likely to use guns and more likely to result in death in the case of their model than with our model, we say guns don't make you safer, they make society more dangerous, and we say that the ultimate goal of this debate has to be to make society safer, and that's why the debate falls to the negative side of the house. It's not 7 minutes.
That was
sorry, I misread my points.
I might actually have another minute. You might keep going?
I actually have another minute to provide some more analysis on the point of legal guns, right? And what I wanted to do was take Paulo's example of the dairy owner, because he said dairy owners should have the right to defend themselves, okay? But the point he missed was that his case was that people should have the right to defend their bodily autonomy and their life. But then his example, he quickly switched it to people should have the right to protect their property, which we don't say is a right, and which is a right he never tried to prove, right? So in our model, the dairy owner shouldn't be armed, and if people are going to rob him, he should let them take their stuff and then let the police solve it afterwards, right? And that's going to mean that he's very unlikely to get shot, people are unlikely to walk in there with guns. Under his model, because the dairy owner is going to be armed, people are going to charge in there with guns, shoot the dairy owner, and then take his stuff. And that's why that example is so bad, because it illustrates that under a model where you allow gun ownership, you make all disputes have to end in someone getting shot, because otherwise it's too dangerous. Under our model, even though crime still happens, you remove the need for that extreme, violent, deadly person-to-person interaction to occur, and that's why we're very proud also to oppose.
Yeah. All right. Well, the lack of respect for the other teams is atrocious. So, I'm
yeah. What's with the Scotsman like?
Well, what's with the Constitution?
I'm sorry, but if I can't hear Gavey over here, then you're not going to be able to hear him on the tape. So maybe you can keep the volume down.
And I agree, you're doing it a lot as well. But at least you're whispering. There was
a point where I couldn't hear what Gavey was saying. So.
Yeah. Well,
It's not if it wasn't facing you, it wouldn't be so obvious. You guys, if you were sitting alone, because you're together, noise is also Paula's quiet.
Alright, so
I would say the interjections have been a bit too much too, though. So.
Sorry.
Yeah, great. Well, that's what I said. The lack of respect is atrocious. So, if we now see what the third legal has to say, Purdon.
Please.
A moment of
when it goes to the fade mode, I don't know.
A moment to shine.
Mine doesn't stop. No, I'll be quiet.
Spot on.
Oh shit.
Our first point that we've brought up in this debate is the right to life and why the individuals have a fundamental reason to protect that. Louis didn't respond to that at all with his preemptive rebuttal because he was talking about protection and property. And even with the other speakers down the line, they're getting confused because this point is independent of this, macro safety point. We say that there's an individual right that every person has to protect their life and that they should be able to use a gun to do that. It's not premised on this point of macro safety numbers. We say that this core issue of whether people have the right to defend their life has not been addressed in that regard in this debate at all. So what will I be talking about? 3 points. Firstly is like the right to life in the introduction, and obviously I talked a bit about it, so I won't go into too much more. Secondly is why good citizens are going to be disadvantaged and why safety is lessened, and why we've shown you in this debate that that's the case. And thirdly, this point which hasn't been addressed, like, it may not even be addressed at all, is this point on, like, you know, corruption in police and corrupt governments. And, you know, this is like a massive part of our case, is that, you know, we're not all living in a lovely, you know, liberal New Zealand democracy. There are, like, you know, practical realities that they need to touch on our point there. So firstly, on this point of right to life, what we told you is that all rights stem from your ability to live in the first place, and that, you know, your right to life is ultimate, so therefore you should have, you know, an absolute ability to protect that. And the only response we got from it is, oh, like, you know, you give up all your powers to defend yourself to the state because they do a better job. When this is obviously not true, because we obviously, you know, self-defense is legal, and even though, like, the rebuttal on citizen's arrest, like, citizen's arrests are legal in certain situations, because we recognise that people, like, should be able to defend themselves against force from others. Like, if someone tries to beat you up, you have, you know, like, a right to punch them and run away, and, you know, the state can't come along and punch them in the face for you. We say that, you know, that right to defence does exist, so we don't think that's very good rebuttal at all. But we say that the core issue on the right to life and being able to protect that hasn't been addressed well by the Affirmative team whatsoever. Now let's take on the second point. This is the point which I'll give credit has been addressed by the Affirmative team, so they've done one thing right, and is on a macro safety level, will we see, for good citizens, will we, what will we see? Okay, what we told you is that, like the state law enforcement and police is not perfect. Like, police can't be everywhere at all times. We say there are plenty of situations, for example, the dairy owner can't rely on, like, seceding their, like, self-defense power to the state. If you live in a rural town with only 40 people and no police officer, and there's someone, you know, who's, you know, beating people up, or, like, you know, trying to kill people, we say that, you know, you can't rely on the state in all situations to protect that. And we say that there's a role there for people to defend themselves, and good citizens can responsibly do that. What response do we get? Oh, like, you know, they don't have the skill to use guns. Well, what we said is, like, firstly, like, you know, if a criminal has a gun, at least having your own makes it, like, you know, better than what it would have been otherwise, and at least it acts as a deterrent. And we said, secondly, like, the skill level is going to be far, like, you know, closer with guns, because, like, you know, if I've got a gun against another gang member who's got a gun, you know, maybe I'm, like, 40% likely to win. But if I'm, like, having a fight with them with my fists, the chance of me winning is, like, not even 1%. So, like, that point just falls down easily. What also we told you is that disincentivises crime. Why? It's because it makes the risk higher for the criminal, but it doesn't increase the reward. If you're trying to steal someone's money, if they've got a gun, it doesn't give them any more money, but it means that there's a higher cost because there's more likely you're going to be injured as a criminal. The only response we got was from Will. It's like, oh, I'll just bring a gun too. But it doesn't address what we told you, is because all criminals, like Paul said, make a calculation in the risk they take when they go try to steal something. The benefits don't increase at all when there's a gun involved, because there's still the same thing that you're stealing. But now that the person that you're trying to steal it off has a gun, that makes it more risky, and that makes it less likely that you're going to commit that crime because you don't want to be harmed. And that's the rational calculus that criminals take. And, like, the thing is, also the point, like, in Nick's introduction about, like, oh, like, we've got all these, like, facts and figures because, like, we live in a libertarian world. Well, that's not true at all. Like, Paul gave me some examples before, like, 24% lower violent crime when there's guns, 19% lower murder rates, 39% lower robbery rates. Don't just point to the US. Switzerland and Israel have legal guns as well, and they have extremely low levels of violent crime, so maybe, you know, they're not libertarian at all. So, like, yeah, we'll go figure. Okay, next point is that a major fact that their case relies on is that, like, criminals are not going to have guns. But we've easily showed you why criminals are going to have guns anyway. Like, firstly we told you is the very fact that, like, law-abiding citizens follow the law, criminals do not. Therefore, when guns are illegal, law-abiding citizens are not going to have guns at all, where criminals and gangs are still trying to actively seek them out so they can use them for bad purposes. And they're like, oh, like, well, what we told you is that firstly there's still going to be production of guns in other countries, and the whole point has been like, oh, we can use metal detectors, and, like, importing, you know, blocking imports is really easy. Like we said, there's a lot of reasons. Firstly, we said there's still production. Secondly, we said there's, like, guns that are already in circulation which don't need to be imported. And we also told you, like, you know, Paul got laughed when he made this point, but he's like, you know, oh, they can put it around the metal detectors, and that's a good point, because, like, you know, maybe Nick wants to put metal detectors along, like, you know, the 200,000 kilometres border between, like, United States and Mexico, but that's just not the reality. Like, drugs, you know, go through in, like, rural areas where there's no one watching it, and guns do the same. Even if it goes through a metal detector, some guns are made without metals and like composite materials, and you know can't be sniffed out by drug dogs. So we say that drugs are more likely to be, you know, figured out in that case either. We say, you know, like even in Europe, where you've got like about 20 or 30 countries, all that have like constant borders all around each other, and you know, given that you don't even need a passport to get through them anyway, you can just like drive straight through without any border security. We say if one country bans guns, there's no way you're going to be able to do that. So if Nick wants to live in his like, you know, fantasy world where we're going to metal detect everything, it's not going to happen, and gangs are still going to be able to get guns anyway. Because we win that point, we've showed you that good law-abiding citizens are at a significant disadvantage because gangs are going to get these weapons anyway, and we've obviously shown you that this import point which we've done false. And on this point about gang violence, like firstly we said that like, you know, we don't, you know, care about gang violence nearly as much as we care about the safety of law-abiding citizens. But secondly, what we told you is like we've still made this point that like gangs are going to have guns anyway. And we also told you that like, you know, even if they don't have guns, like gang violence is still going to be there. Like the same, you know, like rivalries and things are still going to have the same spillover effects that Nick wants to talk to you about anyway. So we don't think that point goes well. Finally, I'm not going to get too long on this point, but it needs to be important because the Affirmative team has not responded to it whatsoever. And what we told you, there are a lot of countries that even though they've got this stable government, they have corrupt police forces that break the law. And what we told you, when citizens have guns, there's like a disincentive for policemen to do corrupt acts. And we say that that's a good reason why people should be able to carry guns. We also said that when police forces from, you know, are like stamping out political opposition and like, you know, the institutionally corrupt, we say that they're less likely to do that when people have guns and are able to protect themselves. And that hasn't been responded to at all, so that point falls to us and will give us the debate. And finally, we told you the point of like, you know, a lot of countries that, you know, even though they're stable, just have like an ineffective police force which is underfunded in rural areas. The state can't do anything about it. In this debate, we've won 2 points because they haven't responded to. The other one we win anyway, we win.
Thank you.